Welcome. In this video, we'll be exploring Abram's big test in Genesis 22. After the ups and downs of Genesis 20 to 21, and indeed of the entire Abraham story, God puts Abraham to the test. And we see what he has come to be made of as a result of his walking with God for more than 25 years. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. This story, known in the Jewish tradition as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, and Akedah is a Hebrew word which means the binding of animals' feet as you're going to put them on the altar for sacrifice. This story, the Akedah, is the climax of Abraham's story. It begins by telling us after these things. And after these things, I think here refers to the fact that what we're going to read happened sometime after what occurred with Ishmael and Abimelech. And we're told that God tested Abraham. The narrator gives us upfront information that Abraham did not have, which shapes our perspective of the story. So when we read that God tells him to sacrifice his son, though we are disturbed by it, we understand it is a test and God does not intend to go through with it. But Abram does not know that it is a test. As far as Abram is concerned, this is a request from God. Now, Abram is more than 100 years old, and he's been through a lot in his journey with God. And yet, even at this stage, he's been tested by God. God is still working on him. You know, sometimes we can be misled into thinking that as we get older in the faith, things should get easier. We should be able to, as we say, coast into heaven. In my observation, as we get older and approach the end, there are more challenges. And some of our greatest challenges are faced towards the very end of our lives. We're told after these things, after all that Abram had been through, but more specifically, the birth of Isaac, the casting out of Ishmael, and interactions with Abimelech, God tested Abraham. What does it mean that God tested Abraham? The Hebrew word on the slide, Nasa, is the word that is used in the verse when it says that God tested Abraham. And that word means to test, to try, to put to the test. That is, it is an attempt to learn the true nature of something. Gordon Wenham says, testing shows what someone is really like, and it generally involves difficulty or hardship. He continues by saying, God is often said to test Israel through hunger and thirst in the wilderness, through false prophets, or through foreign oppression. The purpose of such trials is to discover what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not, to humble you, to do you good in the end. And the use of the term here hints that Abraham will face some great difficulty, but that he will ultimately benefit from it. The test, instead of breaking Abraham, brings him to the summit of his lifelong walk with God. So we're being told by the narrator that God is putting Abraham through difficult circumstances for Abraham's choice to reveal what is in his heart. Abraham is being tested to see who he has become in his faith after all the ups and downs of his journey with God. And God calls him by name, and Abraham responds, Here I am, indicating willingness to do God's will. Now notice the progression of the request, which indicates the great difficulty of it. He says, take your son. Abraham at this point has a son where he before had no son. So take your son. And then he says, your only son, Isaac. And Isaac is his only son because Ishmael has been sent away. Isaac is who Abraham has left. And your only son whom you love. That is a son who is precious to you. Abraham is to take Isaac and he's to go to the land of Moriah and to offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which God will tell him. Which sounds like Genesis 12 when God says, go to this land that I will show you. And so there are many parallels with Abram's call in Genesis 12, including the fact that God in Genesis 12 also asked Abraham to go and to let go of three things that gave him security: his homeland, his kindred, his father's household. Now Moriah has connections with significant mountain sacrifices in the Bible. We read in 2 Chronicles 3:1, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David, his father, at the place that David had appointed, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So Mount Moriah is identified as the location where Solomon's temple was built, and it's also the place where David offered a burnt offering sacrifice to halt a plague on Jerusalem caused by his sin. And it is also the location of Jesus' crucifixion, referred to in the New Testament as Calvary. Now, since Mount Moriah is the same location where Jesus was crucified, unsurprisingly, there are parallels between Jesus and Isaac, who was bound for sacrifice on that same mountain. So, Isaac is Abraham's only son, whom you love. And Jesus is God's only son, John 3:16, but he's also his beloved son. As it says in the NIV in Matthew 3:17 and 17:5, this is my son whom I love. God is speaking. And then Isaac's father is willing to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. Jesus' father actually sacrifices him at Calvary, which is the same place as Mount Moriah. Isaac is made to carry the wood for his sacrifice, and Jesus is made to carry his cross, as we see in John 9:17. Isaac trusts his father and submits to his offering him as a sacrifice. Jesus trusts his father and submits to him, offering him as a sacrifice. Isaac is figuratively received back from the dead, according to Hebrews 11:17-19. And Jesus is literally resurrected from the dead. Isaac is spared by the sacrifice of a ram caught in a thicket. And Jesus is the substitutionary sacrifice for all of us by crucifixion. Now, what stands out about Isaac is his passivity. He submits to his father's binding him for sacrifice. He is not a small child. He's more of a young man, perhaps in his teenage years. His father's quite old. He could easily have resisted him, but he submits to his binding. His father's servant later on finds him a wife, compared to Jacob and Moses, who have to find their own wife at the well. Isaac never leaves the land of Canaan, unlike Jacob, who goes down to Egypt, and Abraham, who also goes down to Egypt. Isaac's wife and his son deceive him to receive his blessing. And he stands out in contrast to his son Jacob, who is very active in seeking to obtain the promise by scheming and exploiting others. So Isaac is someone who is acted upon. Now, Jesus achieves our salvation both by being active and by being acted upon. In the first part of Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, he is very active. But as he moves to Jerusalem, he submits to what others do upon him in his passion, in his suffering. And so he actually achieves our salvation both by acting and also by being acted upon. He's both active and passive depending on what God's purpose demands. Well, God's plan for us involves for us to be both active and passive. And Isaac foreshadows a part of Jesus' ministry that involves him being submitting himself to being acted upon or being passive in order to gain our salvation. So as Gordon Wenham says in the slide here on that final bullet point on the slide, like Isaac, who silently consented to being sacrificed, Jesus was like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, yet he opened not his mouth. And so in a very real sense, Isaac points us towards Jesus. Derek Kidner writes similarly, Isaac too comes briefly into his own. He says that Abraham comes into his own, and he says that Isaac here in this moment also comes into his own, not by what he does, but by what he suffers. Here it seems is his role, undistinguished though he may be in himself. Others will do exploits. It is left to this quiet victim in a single episode to demonstrate God's pattern for the chosen seed to be a servant sacrifice. And of course, that comes to fulfillment in Jesus. There's also an important parallel between Isaac and Ishmael drawn by repetitions and parallels between Genesis 21 and 22. So you see that in Genesis 21, God tells Abraham it's okay to send Ishmael away. And in Genesis 22, God orders Isaac to be sacrificed. In Genesis 21, food and water are taken and given to Hagar for Ishmael. In Genesis 22, the material for the sacrifice is taken before they embark on the journey. In both stories, there is a journey narrated. In both stories, a son, one of Abram's sons is about to die. In Genesis 21, Ishmael is about to die. And in Genesis 22, Isaac is about to die. In both stories, there is this emphasis on fear. In Genesis 21, God tells Hagar, do not fear at the moment of crisis. But in Genesis 22, after the moment of crisis has passed, God says that Abraham fears God. In Genesis 21, God tells Hagar that he has heard what Ishmael has cried. And in Genesis 22, God says to Abraham, you have heard my voice. In Genesis 21, God says of Ishmael, I shall make you into a great nation. In Genesis 22, God says that Abram's descendants will be like stars and sand and so forth. In Genesis 21, God opens Hagar's eyes and she sees a well. In Genesis 22, Abram raises his eyes and sees a substitutionary ram. In Genesis 21, Hagar gives Ishmael a drink and saves his life. And in Genesis 22, Abram sacrifices a ram instead of his son. So in content and outline, the stories in chapters 21 and 22 run parallel to each other, with Abram in a role like Hagar's and Isaac like Ishmael. This parallel suggests that Abram is being put to the test to sacrifice his cherished child because of his and Sarah's action in casting out Ishmael to protect Isaac's inheritance. God puts Isaac in the place of Ishmael. As Victor Hamilton observes, the test for Abraham is not primarily whether to sacrifice a beloved son, though that is no doubt involved emotionally. The real test is whether Abraham will sacrifice a one person who can perpetuate the promises of God, and particularly those promises that his posterity should thrive. The real issue is Abraham's name and his significance. God is getting at the root of Abraham's fear, that he would die without any significance, that his life would be rendered insignificant by death because his name didn't carry on in a son to receive the promises of God. So how does Abraham respond? So Abram rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. Abraham obeys immediately. He rose early in the morning as he did with sending off Ishmael. And we're initially left to wonder what is going on in his mind as he obeys God. But as the story unfolds, we come to see and to understand that Abraham's actions are motivated by his faith in God and by his fear of God. Abraham's faith is dominant, not his fear of harm or adverse circumstances as happened in the past when he failed. He's not trying to preserve and protect the promise by human effort. He's letting go by trusting God to achieve what God had promised. On the 3rd day, Abram lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abram said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Abram's words to his servants give us a picture into what Abram is thinking as he obeys God with this challenging request. I used to think that when Abram says, "I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back to you," that Abram was lying or being deceitful. But as I've read this story over the years and read alongside the New Testament interpretation of it, I've come to understand that Abraham was not lying. And he was not lying because I think he genuinely believed that both he and Isaac would go and worship God by offering Isaac as a sacrifice, and they both would come back to the servants. Abraham had this confidence because at this point in his journey with God, he had come to completely trust in God's faithfulness to keep God's words and to achieve what God had promised, even if it appeared impossible. God had kept his word and given him a son from Sarah when she was 90 and menopausal and he was 100. And since God had promised that it was through Isaac that Abraham's offspring would be reckoned, then even if obeying God's instruction to sacrifice Isaac meant Isaac would physically die, Abraham was confident that Isaac would live again because it was through him that God promised to bring about the promises. Abraham had come to know this God, whom he had been walking with so much that he did not have to clutch the promise he had fulfilled in Isaac. He didn't have to clutch the hope he had sacrificed his life for. He could release it back to God because he was confident in God's faithfulness to keep God's word. And so the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11 and verse 17, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac your offspring shall be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." So Abram, in effect, believed in the resurrection before it was revealed. He believed that God could raise the dead. And in a sense, he did receive his son back from the dead because in his faithful commitment to obey God, Isaac was as good as dead. And God spared Isaac by providing another sacrifice. And Abram, back to the story, took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father?" And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. So Abram took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, which is similar to him laying on Hagar the bread and the water. And it's also similar to Jesus carrying his cross in John 19, verse 17. But I want you to notice Isaac's trusting of his father, which I think points to Jesus' trusting of his father. And Abraham avoids Isaac's question by leaving to God what would take place on the mountain in terms of the sacrifice. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Again, notice Isaac's submission to his father. Abraham takes the knife in his hand to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. This is the third time he says it. He says it first to God, here I am. He says it secondly to his son, here I am. And he says it at the final point that he's about to kill his son, here I am. At all points, he has remained consistently submitted to the will of God. And God says to him, the angel of the Lord, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So God waits until the very last moment to stop Abraham. The angel of Yahweh calls Abraham's name twice, indicating urgency. And Abraham responds, here I am, as he did at the beginning. He surrendered to God's will. And God tells him not to lay a hand on Isaac or do anything to him, because now God knows that Abraham fears him, seeing he has not withheld his only son from him. This was what God was testing to see if Abraham feared God. And to fear God means to honor God in worship and in an upright life. At previous points in Abram's life, his fear of man and of harm and of not having an heir led him to dishonor God and not walk in an upright way. For example, in Egypt, in exposing Sarah to danger and the Egyptians to a curse. In Gerar, in exposing Sarah again and Abimelech and his people to God's judgment. And with Hagar on more than one occasion. But now, Abram has grown to the point that who he is someone who fears God. And this enables him to let go even of his precious only son because he trusts God. Psalm 147 and verse 11 says that the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who hope in his steadfast love. This fear of God is what God desires. And if you notice the parallelism, fear of God is parallel to hope in God's steadfast love. Another way to translate that is God's unfailing love. That word there is the Hebrew word hesed, which refers to God's covenant love. God wants us to trust him and to obey him and to live in an upright way that honors him because we're confident that he loves us and will keep his covenant promises to us because that is the kind of God that he is, regardless of what situation we are in. Well, in verse 13, Abram lifts up his eyes and looks. And behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abram went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abram called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. As God had opened Hagar's eyes to see the well to save Ishmael, Abram looks up and sees a ram who is to be a substitute offering to save Isaac. Abram offers the ram as a burnt offering instead of his son, and he names the place Yahweh will provide. Meaning Yahweh does provide the sacrifice for the burnt offering as Abram had told Isaac that he would in response to the question, where is the lamb? The sacrifice that needs to be provided will be provided by Yahweh himself. And ultimately this finds expression and meaning in Jesus, God in flesh, the Son of God, whom God would provide himself as the ultimate substitutionary sacrifice. On the Mount of the Lord is Jerusalem, or Mount Zion, the Temple Mount, the place of Israel's cult sacrifices, and there Yahweh shall provide for his people. Ultimately, all these sacrifices point to Jesus, who's a perfect sacrifice for all of our sin. Well, in verse 15, we read that the angel of the Lord called to Abram a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." The angel of the Lord calls to Abraham a second time, and Yahweh swears by himself that because Abraham has not withheld his only son, Yahweh will bless Abraham and multiply his offspring as the stars and the sand. And he promises that his offspring will conquer their enemy cities, and through them all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Notice that Abraham is a true covenant partner. God's going to do all of these things because of his grace, but also because Abraham has a role to play. Abraham's choices matter. God won't do it without Abraham's cooperation and participation. God wants Abraham to be a certain kind of man to work through him and his family, and Abraham has now come into his own. Now, this expression, "because you have obeyed me," is in contrast with Genesis 3, where God says to Adam, "because you've listened to your wife," and Genesis 16, where we're told that with Hagar, Abraham listened to his wife. Abraham has passed a test, but God has to take him on a journey to get there. So in Genesis 3:17, we read that God says to Adam, "because you have listened to the voice of your wife," basically the ground shall be cursed. Now, the Hebrew expression, "listen to the voice of," is an idiom meaning obey. And that's why in the NET, the same expression is translated, "because you have obeyed your wife." In Genesis 16, Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So in that verse, Abraham is like Adam in listening to Eve, and that results in chaos in his household. But when we get to Genesis 22, what we learn is that God says that he is going to bless all the nations of the earth through Abraham and his offspring, because you have obeyed my voice. So in Genesis 3 and Genesis 16, Adam and Abraham failed the test because they listened to their wives in disobedience to God. But in Genesis 22, Abraham passed the test because he has obeyed God's voice. Interestingly, Sarah does not feature at all in this story here in Genesis 22, and one wonders what she thought about, or if she even knew what Abraham was up to. So Abraham passes the test, but God had to take him on a journey for him to get there. And so Gordon Wenham makes a point: for the first and last time in Genesis, the Lord swears an oath in his own name, guaranteeing what he's about to say, a guarantee reinforced by the formula, "declares the Lord." From now on, the Lord promises that he will not simply bless Abraham, but really bless him. His descendants will be so numerous that they'll be compared not just to the stars, but to the sand on the seashore. And they will not merely inherit the land, they will conquer it, possessing the gate of your enemies. But more than that, Abraham's descendants, as well as Abraham himself, will be a source of blessing to all the nations of the world. And all this will happen because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, because you have obeyed me. All the promises first made to Abraham decades earlier are now augmented and guaranteed by the Lord unreservedly. It is as if God is effusive in his expression of how he is going to bless Abraham even more than he promised him in the past, because he is so impressed, so exhilarated to see that Abram is finally where he wanted him to be, and that he feared him, he trusted him, he was willing to let go of what he found his security in, and he feared God, and so God says he can work through him. Wenham continues by saying that Abram's long pilgrimage of faith, which has not been without its lapses from true piety, is brought to a triumphant conclusion. God's test had put Abraham on the rack, yet torn between his love for his son and his devotion to God, he had emerged victorious with his son intact and his faithful obedience rewarded beyond all expectation. Notice that the climax of the story is not Abraham receiving a son, but him letting go. The real conflict in the story all along has always been about Abraham trusting God enough to let go. It's always been about fear needing to submit to faith. And so Abraham, we read, returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abram lived at Beersheba. And after these things it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz's firstborn, Buz's brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. So Abram returns to his servants as promised with Isaac, and they returned to Beersheba, where Abraham lived. Then we're told about Milcah bearing children to Abraham's brother Nahor, including Bethuel, who is the father of Rebekah. We're being set up for the introduction of Rebekah into the story as Isaac's wife and the mother of Jacob and Esau, which is what our final video will include a description of finding Rebekah and Abraham and Sarah being buried as the story comes to a close.